All right. Hey, everyone, if you are just joining us, oh, wait, nobody's on yet. There we go.
I'm on as an attendee. All right, I'm going to hop off, everyone.
Hey there, if you're just joining us, we're going to be starting in just a few minutes. If you want to put where you're calling from in the chat, that would be awesome. But we're going to give it a few more minutes for folks to hop on. We're going to start promptly at 12 noon. And just a reminder, if you've never used or called into a webinar before, you can see and hear us, but we can't see or hear you. So if you need to get in touch with us, you can use the chat feature for any IT issues you're having. But if you have a question for Erik throughout the presentation, feel free to use the Q&A feature located at the bottom of your screen. All right, I'm seeing folks calling in from Annapolis and somebody calling in from all the way from Crisfield, so that's awesome. Looks like a slow start. Everybody's going to be joining promptly at noon, I'm assuming. All right. Lonnie wants to know where Erik's cat is. So Lonnie, this is obviously not your first presentation with Erik before. So Erik's cat is outside right now, but not too far away. All right, and again, if you're just joining us, we're in webinar feature in Zoom. So if you've never seen the webinar feature, it means that you can see and hear us, but we cannot see or hear you. So the only way you can communicate with us is either through the chat feature, where if you have any IT issues, feel free to put that in the chat. But if you have any questions for Erik throughout his presentation, feel free to use the Q&A as well. We're going to get started promptly at noon here. But if you're just joining, we'd love for you to put where you're calling from in the chat feature. It's kind of a fun way to see where folks are calling in from all over the state. So far, we've got folks calling from Annapolis and somebody calling in from Crisfield too. So that's exciting. Somebody's calling from New Jersey, but they go to the University of Maryland. Awesome. Very cool. All right. So again, questions can go in the Q&A feature at the bottom of Zoom. Any IT issues you're having or any comments, you can feel free to use the chat feature there. And let's see here. We've got a few more minutes left before we go ahead and get started. And just want to make sure I'm covering everything. There we go. All right. Seeing some familiar names, which is great. But if you are just joining, please put in the chat feature where you're calling from. We'd love to know where everybody's coming from today. And again, this is the webinar feature. So you're probably sound like a broken record by now, but just in case you've never used that before, you can see and hear us, but we can't see and hear you. So if you're wondering what's going on, that's because we're in the webinar feature of Zoom. All right. Let's see, it's 12 o'clock. We're going to give it another minute or so just to give any stragglers a chance to hop on. And, oh, somebody's calling from Richmond. Very cool. Let's see. Got a lot of folks coming in from Annapolis. All right. Very cool. Let's give it one more minute. Yeah, we've got one more minute here to hop on, for everyone to hop on. So if you're just joining us, one last reminder, you can see and hear us, but we can't see and hear you. So today, if you wouldn't mind using the Q&A feature located at the bottom of your screen to ask questions of Erik, we'd really appreciate that. And then you can use the chat feature if you have any IT issues or anything like that. But we'd also like it if you could drop where you're calling from in the chat feature. I think it's just a fun way to see where folks are calling in from all over the state and all over the watershed, apparently, or outside the watershed in some cases here. But we're going to get started. Let's give it 30 more seconds. How you doing, Erik? Are you ready? You look ready.
I am ready to go.
All right. Oh, it looks like somebody's calling from Gambrel. It's not too far from where I live. That's exciting. Let's see. All right. I recognize Bill Barry. He's calling in from Waldorf, so that's cool. Somebody from Southern Maryland here. Would love it if we had somebody from Western Maryland. We're always, we never have a lot of folks calling from Western Maryland. Erik, though, you grew up in Western Maryland, so I guess that counts, right?
Barely.
Yeah. So we've got Erik representing Carroll County today, but we're going to go ahead and get started here. It's 12:02. And it looks like our webinar producer went to Frostburg, and yeah, so I guess that does count today. So we've got Western Maryland represented today, so that's good. All right, well, everyone, we're going to go ahead and get started. Today we're doing a webinar called Before the Bulldozers. It's part of a series of webinars that CBF has been doing since the COVID pandemic, because we recognize that even though we're not able to meet in person, we still needed a way to reach out to our advocates, to our members, and to the general public to educate and advocate for bay-friendly policies. This webinar was created back in August. One of the staff from the communications department reached out to me and said, well, what do you think would be helpful to you? You know, what do you want our members to know? And at the time, I was fielding a lot of emails and calls that week from people who are really frustrated because they had woken up one morning and they had seen bulldozers in their communities clear cutting acres and acres of forest. This isn't an issue that's specific to one region. It happens all over the state. It happens all the time. And here at CBF, we get phone calls all the time from people asking what they can do to stop these bulldozers from clear cutting trees. And a lot of times those calls end up on my phone at my desk because I'm the Maryland Outreach and Advocacy Manager. So I field calls from the public all the time. And it's really heartbreaking for me to tell these folks that their options are really limited by the time the bulldozers are there. So I thought this would be a really great opportunity to talk to Erik Fisher, who is our land use planner here in the Maryland office. He's also our assistant director of the Maryland office. So he wears a lot of hats in our office, but one of his most important roles is to work with our planning and zoning departments across the state, both on the county and state level, and even within a few municipalities, to make sure that we're growing smart and we're keeping the bay and the environment in mind when we develop. So I'm going to turn it over to Erik here to get started on this presentation. And this is just a reminder for folks, if you're just joining us, let's see how many we've got over 20 people on the line now. So if you're just joining us, use your chat feature for any IT issues you're having. You can also drop where you're calling from. It's kind of fun to see where everyone's calling from today, but use that chat feature for IT issues and to let us know where you're calling from. But if you have a question for Erik throughout the presentation, you can use the Q&A feature as well. But Erik, before you get started, can you just tell us a little bit about yourself before we begin?
Sure, thanks, Anna, and great to speak with all of you this afternoon. Beautiful November day. Seems like every year we get a few more of these. As Anna said, I make my living thinking about bulldozers and sewage and dirt. It makes for some fabulous dinner time conversations. As glamorous as it all sounds, it's also really important. And I started my career working in local government as a comprehensive planner for the town of Westminster, also where I grew up. And so I've been on both sides of the desk related to how growth happens in a community. And I've seen it work well, and I've seen things go wrong. So I'm really excited to speak with you all a little bit today about both ends of that spectrum and how to get more right than wrong. But that's it in a nutshell. Anna, can you see the presentation?
Yep, I can see the screen. And if anybody's having any issues, feel free to use the chat feature. But you look all good on my end, Erik. So fire away.
All right, sounds good. And if you have questions that come up during, we'll answer most of them after. But if there's a clarification question, Anna, feel free to jump in, cut me off, let me know there's something that needs attention.
Sure thing, we'll do.
Sounds good. All right, so we are going to start with a story, a short story, but this, for our friend in Southern Maryland attending today might be familiar. This is Mattawoman Creek in Charles County, Maryland, located not far from Washington, D.C. It is located in a heavily developed and heavily developing area, but you wouldn't know it when you were on the creek. This is a magical place that has excellent water quality and excellent natural resources. In fact, it is one of the premier bass fisheries on the East Coast. But for a while, there was concern that it wouldn't stay that way.
Erik, this is Alice, the producer. Could you please, we've had a request for you to speak up a little bit more. That'd be great.
Okay. Let me see if I can move a little bit closer to my microphone. Is that any better?
It's a little better. Yeah, just if you
better.
could just raise your voice just a little bit. I don't think it's a mic issue. I think you're just sitting kind of far back.
Yep.
Okay.
Yep.
Let's see what we can do. Yeah. All right. So one of the reasons why Mattawoman Creek is in such good shape is because its watershed is heavily forested. And that was the big question that was facing Charles County's population, its residents, its community, when some proposals back in the early 2000s were made to change the character of the Mattawoman Creek watershed. What you can see on the left here is a road known as the Cross County Connector, or to be known as the Cross County Connector, that would have extended past that intersection into the forested land that is the Mattawoman Creek watershed. Turning that perspective around 180 degrees, you see what was behind that road and what sprouted along that road in the portion that had already been developed. That is what was proposed for the remainder of the Mattawoman Creek watershed. And there was a lot of well-founded concern that Mattawoman Creek itself would not survive that development. The watershed itself was marked for growth. You can see that black dotted line in the center was the proposed extension of the Cross County Connector from Waldorf to Bryan's Road. But both the brown and the gray are areas that were planned for low to medium density residential development on land that is now, especially in the gray area in the south, highly forested. And if it's not forested, it's generally farmed. Over about 15 years, members from the community worked with business owners, elected officials, other partners at the state and federal government to completely change what was mapped out for Mattawoman Creek. The road is no longer on the books. The land that was zoned for residential development has been rezoned to a watershed conservation district, whose primary purpose is to preserve Mattawoman Creek and keep forest in forest and farms in farms. It's a remarkable turnaround. It's a great story, and we could spend hours just talking about how it happened. But we're going to try and spend the next 30 minutes talking through some of the things that they did and how they might be applied in your situation as well. Now, I will say this story isn't over. They're still fighting hard in Southern Maryland and in Charles County in particular, because things like this can change back. But we have the high ground right now in Charles County, and there's a lot of lessons that we can learn. So why does growth matter when we're talking about water quality? Well, two major reasons. One is eutrophication, which is when nitrogen is emitted from smokestacks, tailpipes, the power we consume, the vehicles we drive. It comes down from the air, lands in the water, generates algae blooms that die off and suck oxygen out of the water, harming our natural resources and resulting in things like fish kills. We also have stormwater pollution, which takes nitrogen as well as sediment off of the land into our waterways, creating cloudy conditions that can literally bury oyster bars, and also cloud the water so that underwater grasses can't grow and thrive, which throws the whole system out of balance. The good news here is the growth doesn't just happen. When I was little and I saw Dunkin' Donuts pop up on the corner, I figured that it was fairy dust, but that's not the truth. The truth is that the Dunkin' Donuts got there as a result of a very long and involved process with many steps along the way and many opportunities for public input. That's what we're going to focus on today. This is one way to look at the growth and development process, at least as it stands in Maryland, and this is generally applicable to states around the Chesapeake Bay watershed. And it starts all the way back at the top left with elections. We're going to talk about each one of these steps in more detail. But one thing I want you to note off the bat is the color change at the beginning of this process from blue through gray down to bright red at the bottom. And what that color is intended to reflect is the amount of discretion that the community has to control development and how it changes over time in the process. At the very beginning, when you're choosing your elected leaders, you're building relationships, and you're making a comprehensive plan for your community, the world is open. There's a lot of different possible futures for any piece of ground. But by the time you get into a subdivision plan or building permits or the bulldozers on the site, there's very little that can change in terms of what's going to happen on that site. So it's important to get engaged early, and it's important to get engaged often. But how do we actually do that? Step one is to vote. It is not too late to vote. It is too late to vote in the presidential election, although we don't know who has won. But it is not too late to make your voice heard for growth and development. In fact, I would argue that the next election in 2022 will be more consequential for growth in Maryland than the one that we have just, that we are in right now. This is because our state leaders and our local leaders are elected in midterms, and they have a tremendous amount of power over what happens on the ground. State leaders like the governor and the legislature set the ground rules for planning. They spend money on major infrastructure. Where do the highways go? Where do the rail lines go? Their agencies like Maryland Department of the Environment rule on environmental permits like wetland permits, other water quality discharge permits. Elections affect how those things play out. And on the local level, your county commissioners or your county council and your county executive are responsible for master plans and zoning, water and sewer service areas, and in many cases, the development plans themselves. And if they're not directly responsible for approving development plans, they appoint planning commissioners who make those decisions. So as we approach the 2022 midterms, and I know approach is a scary word already, be on the lookout for voter resources. CVF puts out, usually every 4 years, a suite of actions that the next set of elected officials can take to improve growth and development. You can take that suite of actions, ask candidates where they stand, and let your own voice be heard so that they know that growth and development is a priority for you. CVF is a 501c3 organization, so we can't endorse specific candidates, but we can absolutely make sure that the Bay and growth and development is front of mind in an election. The next step in the development process is to build relationships. Policy is a conversation. This is something I didn't understand before I entered the policy world. I thought that policy was a reflection of science and data and making the right decision based on that. And of course, that is a role. But policy documents ultimately simply write down what most people are agreeing on at any given time. And if you want to influence policy, you need to be part of that conversation. What does being part of that conversation look like? It looks like from day one, even before someone is elected, meeting them, learning what's important to them, sharing what's important to you, and demonstrating to them that the environment in your community has a constituency that places a high value on it. But it's not only about the elected officials. We also need to make relationships with others who have a big say in how development moves forward. And not the least of that is agency staff. You have a planning and zoning department in your county or your town. And having a relationship with those staff folks who often last much longer than an elected official in that role, you will get notice of applications. You will get advance notice of hearing dates. You will be able to weigh in on staff reports. They won't show you the staff report, but the content that you provide in your conversations with them, in many cases, will make its way in. They make recommendations. Elected officials lean on them. It's important to have a relationship with agency staff.
And Erik, a quick clarifying question or point. So I know that in some cases when a new county council executive or county commissioner president takes office, sometimes the at-will or political appointees, including agency heads, will be replaced. But that doesn't mean that the agency staff necessarily gets replaced across the board, right?
That's absolutely right. You will often see a new planning director, but their direct reports have probably been there 20, 25 years and know what's under every single rock in the county.
Thank you.
It's a great point. We'll talk more about community groups later, but it's better not to go alone. And then finally, a relationship that's often overlooked when you're trying to influence development in your community is the media. If you know your local reporters, then you will be able to help them generate stories. They might not know what's going on. They don't know what you know, they know what they hear. And if they're hearing from you, you're more likely to get stories placed in local media about these growth issues. You can provide data for their stories. You can tell them who to talk to, who knows what's up, who's being affected, and you might be quoted yourself. A relationship with local media is extremely valuable when you're trying to influence development in your community. And as I said previously, these conversations can and should be happening right now. The final step before we start to look at specific development plans is engaging in the comprehensive plan. Comprehensive plan answers the biggest questions about growth and development in a community. Where do we grow? How much are we going to grow? What do we conserve? What major infrastructure is needed? The comprehensive plan is the first document that starts to take ideas about growth, like we want more or we want less, or we want it here or we want it there, and put it down into a written form. It casts the mold, and this is where the community has the largest amount of discretion in determining where and what. Here are some ways that you can engage in your comprehensive plan. This is a rotating process about every 10 years. Sometimes it's updated more frequently. It has to be updated every 10 years, but usually after a new election, the elected officials want to take their own swing at it. To look at the current comprehensive plan in your county or town in Maryland, you can go to the Maryland Department of Planning's website and look up their comprehensive plan library. You can find it right there. They also have a series of models and guidelines that talk more about expectations that state law has for local comprehensive plans, what needs to be in them, and how to go about planning. It doesn't tell them what to plan, but it does tell them how. I'll stop here and say that all of the resources that I'm sharing today will be made available to you in a page of links that we will send out after the presentation.
Yeah, and all of you should have my email address from the autoresponder from when you registered. So if you guys have any questions about where to locate the comprehensive plans for your county, always feel free to drop me an email as well.
Thanks, Anna. Another thing that you can do as you're preparing to engage when the comprehensive plan is open in your community is look up some best practices. There are communities all around the country doing amazing things with planning and zoning and development. Many of those are captured on the American Planning Association's website, planning.org. But you can also look at professional interest sites like planetizen.com, where they have a daily blog and feature ideas and resources and research papers that are open to the public. Bringing these resources to your community is an invaluable and positive way to build relationships with elected officials and other stakeholders. And then finally, don't hesitate to participate in an official capacity. There's usually a citizens advisory committee that helps develop the plan. Ask to be on it, or find one of your friends or your neighbors to be on it if you're busy or otherwise unable to participate. That is a direct voice at the ground level of the comprehensive plan. And whether you participate in that CAC or not, there will be public workshops and public hearings for you to speak your mind. Okay, so we've covered the blue part of the development process where you have the most discretion to shape the future for your community. we are now headed into what I call the muddy middle, which is where environmental laws, capital projects, and the zoning ordinance all sort of spin around together to create conditions that are better or worse for development. And we will talk through those next. The first one is capital projects. For most of us, there are 4 seasons. For elected officials, there are 2. One is budget season, and the other one is not budget season. Budget season occurs in 2 chunks. One is December and early January, when agencies submit their requests up to the county council or the board of commissioners or the town council. This is an important time if there is something that takes money in your community that you want to see happen, or something you don't want to see happen, like a sewer line extension or a road in the wrong place. You want to be talking to the agency staff to make sure that those requests are going in and going in a way that is consistent with the comprehensive plan. Then in April and May, the draft budgets are out for hearings, and that's your time to speak publicly to your elected officials about what investments should be made and which ones should not. This is all reflected in a local capital improvement plan or capital improvement program. It's 6 years worth of projects, so it's a big deal. And again, the questions to answer for your elected officials: what initiatives need funding? Maybe some land conservation. Maybe the land conservation fund hasn't been funded in 4 or 5 years. What projects are out of step? Does that sewer line up with the comprehensive plan? Is it going to result in a lot of new growth? Maybe we shouldn't be spending money on that. This sounds kind of esoteric, but a couple of years ago, that cross-county connector in Charles County popped back up in the county's CIP. Community was on it and got it pushed back. The second piece in this mushy middle is the environmental laws that exist complementary to, but outside of the zoning ordinance. Some of these are federal, some of these are state, some of them are local, and they deal with specific environmental features, natural features on a site, and what can happen when they are under development. There is a lot of discretion in interpreting these laws. We'll talk about that more in a little bit. And local governments, in most cases, are allowed to strengthen them. They're allowed to go beyond the minimum. Here are a few. We are not going to talk about each one, but I'll show you a resource that you can use to get more information. And I wanted to highlight the Forest Conservation Act briefly, because this is a great example of local communities, because of their citizen interest, that have strengthened the act beyond the state minimum. When you cut trees for development in Maryland, at a minimum, you have to put 1 acre back for every 4 that you cut. It's about a 75% loss. But in Howard and Anne Arundel counties, you have to put 2 acres back for every 4 acres you cut. And in Carroll and Frederick counties, you have to replace every acre of trees that you cut. Why do you have to do that in Carroll and not in Hartford? Because the community and the elected officials said so. It really comes down to that. They had the opportunity to strengthen the law, and they did. This will apply to every development from now until the law changes again. It's a big deal and a great opportunity for you to engage in your community. So, learning more about these laws, we have citizens guides on our website that go through some of them in detail. You can also go to the local or state government website, which usually has more detail about each law. But we encourage you to start with these guides. Gives you a pretty in-depth review of what each law does and how you can engage in that process. When is it a great opportunity to strengthen a local environmental law or a state environmental law? Here are a few we've seen. When a comprehensive plan is being updated, there is an interest in making sure that the environmental laws line up with the goals of that comprehensive plan. So if the comprehensive plan says we want to save our forests, well, maybe the comprehensive plan can also say we need to strengthen our Forest Conservation Act. And that's something that you can offer to the process. Sometimes the state will change the minimum standards. This forces the local government to update their local ordinance, and that is another opportunity to make it stronger than what is being changed. And then thirdly, and we've seen this as well, sometimes there's an elected official who felt they were elected to make a change. And this goes back to what we talked about during elections, sharing your priorities. This is what happened in Frederick County, where we saw the recent strengthening from 1 to 4 acres to 1 to 1. So each of these are potential entry points to help strengthen. And you don't want to go it alone. It is much more effective if you are part of a team. And there are groups out there all over the state. This is a map of the member organizations associated with the Choose Clean Water Coalition. It looks like there's at least one in almost every county. And those counties that don't have dots here, we can certainly connect you with a local watershed organization in that county that is also doing this kind of work. Zoning. Zoning lays down the law. So if comprehensive plans catch the mold, zoning lays down the law. These are the specific legal requirements for development on the parcel level. It determines what specific uses are allowed on a property, how much density is allowed on a property, and what kind of design standards apply. Rezoning can only happen 3 different ways in Maryland. One of them is after a comprehensive plan is updated. You want your zoning to match your comprehensive plan. Another one, and this is often expanded by the development community, is a mistake in the original zoning. I want to point out that does not mean that somebody didn't get the decision they wanted. A mistake is an actual clerical mapping error. It's a very narrow way of getting a rezoning. And then finally, that there's been a change in the community character that the comprehensive plan did not anticipate. That is also a very high bar. The vast majority of rezonings you will see will be the result of a comprehensive plan update, which is why it's so important to get engaged early. When there is a rezoning in your community, you want to check the context. You want to look at the county's comprehensive plan and see what the recommendations for that area are, because that rezoning has to be consistent with it. These comprehensive plans are available at MDP. The county zoning maps that are current are usually published on the county's websites. The next thing you want to do is to characterize the site that is proposed for rezoning. What kind of natural features exist on that site? And there are a number of opportunities that you have to do this from your bedroom slippers in your own house. Because Maryland has this great system called IMAP and a sort of a sibling system called Merlin, which has dozens and dozens of data layers to help you characterize the natural features, the community character of a particular site. This one layer, for example, in IMAP shows the degree of slope on a site. This one shows stream health. Again, feel free to log on to IMAP, see what's out there, because the more you can build the profile of a site, the better your argument's going to be for whether that rezoning should move forward or not. And then finally, again, at a rezoning, this is a recurring theme, connect with your neighbors, go to the hearings. Zoning is where the law is laid down. So that is the mushy middle, where environmental laws, capital projects, and the zoning ordinance all work together to create development plans. Let's look at development plans. This is the point, as Anna said earlier, in which we get the most calls at CBF. If the bulldozers aren't already rolling, it's because there's a subdivision proposal on the table. And it's important to understand that at that point, the questions that can be answered are different. Where should the internal street network be located? Where will the open space go? How should regulations that are already on the books that we talked about earlier be implemented on this site? Questions that you really can't ask or answer at the site plan stage are, should development be here at all? Can we save every tree on the site? Site plans express the law. They don't make the law. And so it's important to understand what's on the table and what's not at this point in the process. How do you know when a site is marked for development or is in the process of being considered for approval? In many counties, you can actually do this with your bedroom slippers on as well. Development pipelines are online in many different counties. Again, we'll send these links out to you, but you can click on a site and see what's proposed, where it is in the process in relation to other properties and natural features. It's a really great resource. And if you're part of a community group, if you have somebody appointed to check this list once a week, once every 2 weeks, depending on how much development activity there is, it can give you early warning so that you can be in the process early on. Once there is a specific project of concern or excitement to you, you can use Maryland Finder, which is at the Maryland Department of Planning, to get more information about that site itself, who owns it, when it was transferred, how big it is, look at the platting history of the lot. It's all there, probably more than you will need. I want to spend the last portion of this presentation digging in a little bit to the discretionary power of a local agency to protect natural features, because this is an enormous universe of possibility within the site plan. For example, a local agency within the law can use their discretion to determine whether or not a forest or historic resource meets the definition of something that is protected. Not all forests deserve equal protection under the law based on how the law is written. Is it a priority for protection or is it not? That's a discretionary power based on subjective criteria. The developer is usually responsible to minimize damage or implement certain controls to the maximum extent practicable. What does that mean? There are some criteria that help us define what it means, but it's not a math problem. There is opinion, there is analysis, there is all of this that goes into determining whether or not a developer has done the maximum that they could do to minimize damage or implement the best controls. That is a discretionary power of the local government. And then finally, sometimes it's difficult to comply with the law because of the specifics of a site. And we'll look at a case of that in a second. When is a waiver or a variance from normal requirements justified or warranted? That is a discretionary power of local government. And the reason why I'm highlighting this is because even though you can't necessarily argue that a site shouldn't be developed at all once there's a site plan on the table, you can influence how this discretionary power is exercised. Let's take a look at this. This is a hypothetical subdivision, obviously not from here because it says Lake Winnipeg. I purposely didn't want to pick on anybody in the state of Maryland. But we've got a proposed subdivision here, and I've theoretically added a few forest stands to it. Here's a question that involves discretion. Is this piece right here a priority forest? Now, under Maryland's Forest Conservation Act and local forest conservation ordinances, priority forests generally have to be of a certain size. They generally need to be contiguous with other forests. But there's no one map out there that says ahead of time that that forest is priority. If it is, it's not supposed to be cut. And you've got lots proposed right on that piece of forest. If it's not, go ahead and take it down, but you got to at least mitigate. That's how the law works anyway. So is this a priority forest? That is a debate that you should and could have with your agency staff, with your planning commission, and potentially even with your elected officials. As I said, it's on a lake, which means that we have a stream buffer. Does this buffer, which gets very close, in fact, almost completely covers the sewage reserve areas of many of these lots, does that justify a variance? What if someone needs to put in a deck or a pool or a home solar kit? Are we creating a situation here with this lot arrangement where this stream buffer, which is normally just straight up required, that a waiver or a variance is justified for lots 1, 2, 3, and 4 on the northern part of that site? If so, then we're good to go. But if not, there probably needs to be a reconfiguration of lots. It's another discussion you can have. And let's look at topography a little bit. So if you're not familiar with a topo map, the elevations go up as you get closer to the right side of the screen here. And the tighter those lines are, the steeper the slope. So the question here is building lot 7, which is right inside that yellow rectangle, on that steepest part of that slope, does that represent the developer's best effort to manage stormwater? Because water is going to be flying off of that lot, possibly causing erosion and carrying pollutants with it. So here are just 3 opportunities to exercise discretion within the laws and the guardrails that those laws set. If you want to be part of this conversation, you need to be in the agency's office. You need to be out looking at the site. You need to be talking with neighbors so that you have the information and the access to talk about how to deal with these issues. And of course, there is the fundamental question about whether this site should be subdivided at all. Because if we look at it the way nature sees it, I'm not sure I would have picked this location for a subdivision. Again, once the site plan is on the table, that's not on the table. But if we're talking about the comprehensive plan, if we're talking about a rezoning, or even more fundamentally, if we're talking about the next election, that is absolutely a conversation that you are entitled to have as a resident, as a citizen of the community. And sometimes it works. This is just one small piece of the coalition that we had in Charles County, celebrating in a barbecue one day on the banks of Mattawoman Creek, the comprehensive plan that changed a development district the size of Washington, D.C. into a conservation area the size of Washington, D.C. Still fighting that fight, but it's nice to be on the side we're on at this point. And we did it because we engaged in every step of the process. One final note. Sometimes you're going to see a bulldozer one day and you're going to be surprised by it. What can you do at that point? There are 2 things you can do. One is to monitor activity on the site. There are checklists available from organizations like Chesapeake Stormwater Network, SEDS Incorporated. They're very user-friendly. Again, we'll send links to these where you can informally audit a construction site to determine whether or not they are following the rules, keeping sediment on the property. Another thing to do is to compare the construction to the approved plans. Most of the time, things go according to plan. Sometimes the bulldozers get a little carried away. So you want to make sure that the trees that are being cut down were approved to be cut down. Doesn't always line up. If you see clearing or construction and you know a permit hasn't been issued, or if you see clearing or construction that looks like it doesn't match up with the plans, you see flags or fences missing, or you see muddy water running off of that site, do not hesitate to call your local soil conservation district or the planning office. And if it looks really bad, call the Maryland Department of the Environment directly. They have a 24-hour hotline. Development is a sensitive process, and it is important that it be done according to the law and according to the plan. So I will leave it on this screen, which is a basic summary of what we had already discussed. And then maybe we can get into a little bit of Q&A. I know that was a lot of information in a very short period of time, but I hope that it has created some touchstones for you to think through how best to engage in development in your community, whether it's a comprehensive plan update or something going up next door.
Okay, great. Erik, thanks so much for that. Yeah, and I appreciate that second to last slide you shared. You know, we were brainstorming this a few weeks ago with some other staff, and they said, well, make sure you include what you do if the bulldozers are already there too, because there are still some options. You're extremely limited, but we want to make sure that you do know that there are still some options. Very important to be able to know what's going on in your community. So we've got some great questions coming in through the Q&A feature here. I'm going to go ahead, Erik, if you don't mind, and just launch right in. Is that okay with you?
Yep, sounds good.
Okay, great. So the first question I thought is important. One of the attendees wants to know, what does the Maryland Department of the Environment do compared to the Department of Natural Resources in the zoning and planning process? So we talked a lot about the zoning and planning process on the county level, but these are state agencies. First of all, do the state agencies play a role? And if so, what do these 2 agencies do?
Yep, that is a great question. Let's take the Department of Natural Resources first. The answer there is much less from a regulatory perspective than the Maryland Department of Environment does, but they are not completely separated from the process. If you are talking about land within 1,000 feet of tidal water, that is the Chesapeake Bay critical area. That was one of the state environmental laws that I mentioned in the presentation that we didn't have time to cover in detail. But the Department of Natural Resources staffs the Maryland Critical Area Commission, which has approval authority over new development within that 1,000 feet in conjunction with the local government. So that is a very active role. They also manage a lot of things within the critical area, like forest loss, resource use, and that sort of thing. Sometimes enforcement and variances as well.
Cool.
The other thing that DNR does in the development process is provide technical information. They support local analysis of whether a forest is priority for protection or not, and that sort of thing. The Department of the Environment plays a pretty active role in the planning process, because one of the things that I wasn't able to cover today due to time is that there is a separate plan for water and sewer extensions in a local jurisdiction. That is also a critical engagement point, because growth in many cases is like a garden. It needs water just like a flower. And so you're going to see houses sprout up along these water and sewer lines. MDE actually approves or denies or conditions those local plans when it comes to water and sewer service. That's for public health reasons. It's for smart growth reasons. They have to look at both of those factors when deciding whether to approve those plans or not. Those are also open for public comment, so you can participate in that process. They have to be updated at least once every 3 years. The other major role that MDE has in development is some individual permits. They issue discharge permits, and they also issue wetland permits. Most development projects of size are going to need a wetland permit unless they're on very high ground. And MDE ultimately makes the final decision about whether to allow construction that affects the wetland or the wetland buffer, which is usually about 25 feet beyond the edge of the wetland itself. And then a discharge permit usually comes into play on very large projects where they have their own sewage treatment system, because you can't just run a pipe into a creek in Maryland or even apply directly to the land in Maryland without getting a permit through the Maryland Department of the Environment. That's another opportunity where you can request a hearing, get more information from the department about what the applicant wants to do, and participate in that process as well.
Cool. Thanks, Eric. Yeah, and so I guess the bottom line is there's lots of pressure points you can put on, both at the county and state level. So yeah, unfortunately, we don't have the time to cover it today, but the state does play a fairly active role in planning and zoning. The next question here is a good one. Is there an application process to join a citizens advisory committee, or is there a standard process in each county to have a citizens advisory committee? And this is actually something I'm interested in as well. I don't know much about this process. I'm hoping you do, Eric.
Sure. So that reminded me to talk about the Planning Commission a little bit as well, but they are different things. So the Citizens Advisory Committee for a comprehensive plan is done at the option of the jurisdiction, but almost nobody is going to write a comprehensive plan without having some structured citizen involvement along the way. And that's usually the form that they take. Sometimes there is a formal application process outlined by the local government. They'll post it on their website. They'll send it out by word of mouth that they're looking for people to, hop on this thing. And then whichever subcommittee of the elected body is managing this will make decisions about who's on that or not. Or maybe staff will say, okay, we can take up to 40. Let's sort through, make sure we've got a good cross section of the community. So keep your eyes out for that. And that's another case where a relationship with agency staff, a pre-existing relationship with agency staff, can really help you out, because if you know these people, then you'll get notice one way or another. If you don't, you might miss it. The Planning Commission is a formally established, required by state law body in a local jurisdiction that is a standing committee. It does much more than just the comprehensive plan reviews development projects and zoning ordinances and the like. That is always a formal application and appointment process with terms that usually outlast the elected officials that appoint them. It's usually for a 5-year term. That is also a citizen-led body. And the idea of it is to create some airspace between politics and development. That gap is usually pretty thin, but it's at least one step removed.
Thanks, Eric. The next question we have is from Bill Berry down in Waldorf. He wants to know, in terms of priority forest designations, are they assigned by the state, or can local governments declare an area a priority forest?
Yep. So this is a great example of how discretion is exercised and set up. The general criteria for priority forest is set out in state law, which then has to be adopted and can be modified in the strengthening direction by the local jurisdiction. So a local jurisdiction can add criteria or strengthen criteria for a priority forest, make it more broad, but they cannot make it more narrow than the state minimum, which is a good thing. So some of the attributes that, and then the determination of whether a specific forest is priority or not is done when a development application comes in. So there's no jurisdiction that's going out there countywide and saying this patch of forest is priority under the Forest Conservation Act and this piece is not. That map doesn't exist. There are maps out there that say these forests in general are valuable, and you've probably heard the term green infrastructure hub, green infrastructure corridor, targeted ecological area, forest interior dwelling species habitat. All of those maps exist. But for the legal purpose of development, that information is taken in on a site-specific review by the local jurisdiction when development is proposed. And what happens is that in many cases, that leads a reviewer to look only at the site and start to prioritize the forest within the site. So on a countywide basis, that entire chunk of forest might look like it's really important. But a reviewer's first instinct is going to be to say, which pieces of this on this site can I save? And that's not them just being myopic, it's also them being realistic in many cases, because like we said, zoning assigns a certain amount of development density that is very close to a right that the developer then has. So it is a very discretionary based process that is based on general criteria set out in state law. I hope that answers the question.
Yeah, I think that's pretty good. Bill knows where to find you if he needs more clarification there. And I have a couple more questions here. Tina asked a question about ag reserve. I'm not sure exactly what the question, I'm going to need you to clarify a little bit, Tina, if you could just retype your question. I'm not sure if it was a spelling error, a typo, or what, but I've got two more here while we wait for Tina. Somebody asked, is there a certain time of year where more site plans are submitted? Trying to figure out if there is a before the bulldozer season.
Yeah, right. There's budget season and not budget season. I have not, in my years of doing this, found that there is one time of year over another when more stuff comes in. There are obviously times of year when more bulldozers are out there. And there are also very specific times of year when a developer is allowed to do what we call perk tests, short for percolation tests. If you're developing in a rural area, you're not going to be hooking into a public sewer system. You're going to be developing individual septic systems for each site. And that can only be done when the water table is at the right spot. If it's too high, you're not going to get a good reading. If it's way too dry, you're not going to get a good reading. But in terms of when applications come in, the two times we really see a burst, one are when the economy is doing well, and that's more macro. And then the other, frankly, is when the community is successful and one of these environmental laws is strengthened. There is usually a cutoff by which to who that law applies. So if it says this law will apply to any application received after December 31st of this year, you're gonna see a bit of a rush in October, November, and December before that new law goes into effect. And that's something to watch as well, because in some cases, those projects have been working diligently to develop an application and have sunk a lot of money into it. may have a case for being what we call grandfathered. Others are one step removed from a napkin drawing. And in that case, you really got to question whether or not that was a legitimate application.
Thanks, Eric. And now Tina, she clarified here, and now this is a specific development project, but I think you might be familiar with this one, Eric. It says, Tina wants to know, where does the process stand regarding zoning to place solar panels in the Montgomery County Agricultural Reserve?
The answer is I don't know.
Oh.
I'm not tracking the Montgomery County one as closely as some others. I know the Critical Area Commission has been looking at regulations to govern solar, but I'd be happy to take a look at that.
Yeah, Tina, follow up with me offline, and we can connect you with folks. I know that there's been a few organizations working on that. CBF just hasn't engaged on it quite yet. But you know, this does. Let's see, we've got a few minutes. Do you just want to talk about solar panels? It's solar installations kind of taking on a bigger role in the development process recently. So do you just want to address that real quick, Eric?
Yeah, absolutely. And if there's no further questions, I got one more thing I'd like to say.
Okay, we've got one more question, but we've got at least 5 minutes left.
Great.
So
sounds good. Solar panels are a tough one for CBF, and I think for a lot of us who want to do right by the environment when we're talking about growth and development, climate change and water quality. CBF found ourselves, along with many others, investing heavily in opposing a 200-acre plus solar farm down in Charles County last year. We were ultimately successful in defeating that proposal. The reason why we had to oppose it was because it was to be located on a completely forested site with some steep slopes that drains directly to what's known as a Tier 2 watershed. It's the highest quality watershed, or the highest quality streams within the state of Maryland. There are not very many of them left. And we felt that the deforestation on that site outweighed the benefit of the clean energy. Is it really clean energy at that point was the question that we had to ask ourselves. Generally, CBF is supportive of solar going in. We see it as a big part of our climate solution, our clean energy future. We're just asking for a plan. And it's pretty consistent with what we've been talking about here today. Should we be located? We don't need to develop solar in every acre of Maryland in order to hit our goals. There's estimates out there that to meet our current standard, which of course is, could be higher, but to meet our current standard of 14.5% from solar, we only need 14 to 25,000 acres of ground all the way across a 6 million acre state, if you include the Bay. So there's plenty of room to work around things that we don't want to develop, like prime agricultural soils, like high quality forests, like Tier 2 watersheds. It has mystified me how slowly the state has worked towards a comprehensive solar plan for siting in Maryland. I'm starting to see GIS work, geographic information systems, computer mapping, coming out about where best to put these systems. That's very encouraging, but as of yet, there's no statewide plan, and counties in many cases are preempted from doing too much regulatory work on solar siting because the Public Service Commission, which is a state agency, has the authority to issue those permits. So it's a delicate dance. We think the answer there is absolutely a plan so that we can achieve our renewable energy goals without hurting our goals like eating food or protecting our waterways.
yeah, Eric, thanks for addressing that. I think as we mentioned, there's gonna be more and more pressure to put up these large solar developments in the coming years. So having a plan is definitely going to be important. So I appreciate, Tina, you asking that question. Bill Berry, you've got a question that's kind of specific, I think, to Charles County. So I'll follow up with you offline about that one. Eric, and you've got about a few more minutes left if you just you said you wanted to touch on something else real quickly.
Yeah, I didn't put this explicitly in the presentation, but I want to just for a moment talk about negotiation and compromise when you're pushing back on a development project. To be clear, CBF doesn't oppose every project. In fact, we don't oppose most projects. Projects that represent smart growth, that go according to plan, ideally are supportive of transit infrastructure and represent revitalization. Those are great projects. But where we run into issues is where something very environmentally sensitive is marked for significant development. And ultimately, or what happens very quickly tends to be that folks on both sides of the issue jump to forming a position. And what I mean by a position is a very specific answer to the question of what should be done here. Like, there should be 40 houses, or there's a forest here, there should be 10 houses. Or as I showed a little while back with that waterway buffer, should we just waive the requirement entirely or not? And usually one person says yes, or one person says no. One person says 40 and one person says 10. And what usually ends up happening is you end up with 25. And did that really solve anybody's problem? And so what I like to encourage, and I try to remind myself when I'm in these kinds of discussions, is that we should be debating issues and negotiating issues rather than positions for as long as possible. The issue behind should there be 40 houses or 10 houses is whether or not we can save the forest. And there might be other options. What if we make each lot half as big as we were going to before? Well, then you can save half the forest and still develop those 40 houses. In the case of a stream buffer, should we waive the requirement entirely and let the sewage or the septic system go in 50 feet from the waterway? Or if the issue is water quality, maybe there's another way to address that. Maybe we don't do septic systems at all. Maybe we do a small community system, or we extend a nearby public sewer line with appropriate growth controls to pick up that new development so that there's no septic system at all and a variance isn't needed. When you debate issues like, I need to protect this waterway, as opposed to, I need there to not be a septic system here, then your universe of possibilities opens up, and it's easier to find common ground with the other side or with an elected official, because some elected officials really like to conserve land. Some elected officials really like to build on land. Most of them just don't want fires on their desk. And if you can be part of finding a way to put out that fire, ultimately you're going to get traction real quick. So I just offer that as a perspective going forward as you go forth and do great things for the environment, on this issue.
I think that's a great note to end on. I mean, I'm getting some echo here, but we're coming up on the 1 hour mark, but I want to thank everyone for joining us today. And Erik, thank you so much for your time. I've heard this presentation, versions of this presentation several times over the past few years, but I always learn something new listening to you share your knowledge. But really, I think that's an excellent note to end on, given the fact that we're recording this a few days after election day. There's always common ground, and we look forward to working with all of the folks on this call today to help advocate for the Bay around the state and around the watershed. So everyone have a great afternoon and save the Bay.